It was a crisp autumn afternoon in the town of Maplewood, where the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves filled the air. The small town, with its neat rows of houses and quiet streets, appeared serene, almost idyllic. Maplewood was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where everyone knew everyone, and life followed the same predictable rhythm. You could almost set your watch by the movements of its residents, children playing in their yards, older folks strolling along the sidewalks, and the familiar hum of cars on the main street. The town, in its own gentle way, was an anchor for its people, a place where history and tradition lived in every corner. But for Elijah Johnson, a 15-year-old high school student, Maplewood felt like a gilded cage. On the outside, everything seemed perfect: a peaceful community, hardworking families, and a proud history. But beneath the surface, there were unspoken rules, judgments, and divisions that no one dared acknowledge, but everyone knew were there. Elijah had spent most of his life in Maplewood, but even now, after all these years, he felt like an outsider. To the townsfolk, he was no more than the color of his skin, and no matter how hard he worked, how good a student he was, or how polite he behaved, there were eyes that saw him as something less, something different. It was a cold, gray afternoon when Elijah walked home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The clouds hung low in the sky, threatening rain, and the chill in the air made his fingers ache. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his mind lost in thoughts of his latest project for his art class. He had been sketching a new design for a digital mural, filled with colors that he could almost see in his mind. The swirls of reds, blues, and yellows were as vivid as his dreams. He longed to bring these images to life, to prove to himself that his creativity could lead him out of this quiet town and into a world of possibilities. But Maplewood, for all its charm, didn't offer many opportunities for someone like him. The town had its prejudices, buried deep beneath the surface, ingrained in its culture. Elijah had been raised by his mother, a strong, hardworking woman who had instilled in him values of respect, honesty, and kindness. She told him to always rise above, to aim for the stars, and never let the world around him define who he was. But Elijah could feel the weight of judgment every time he stepped out into the streets. As he made his way down Oak Street, the familiar sound of his sneakers hitting the pavement echoed in his ears. The rhythmic sound was comforting, almost like a heartbeat that kept him grounded. Elijah had grown used to the routine, walking down this same street every afternoon, past the same houses, the same trees, and the same sidewalks. It was his life, his world. Yet, today, something felt different. There, across the street, standing in front of her grand house, was Mrs. Sarah Thompson. Elijah had seen her countless times before, her silver hair always immaculately styled, her sharp eyes scanning the street with a look of quiet disdain. She was a widow, and from what Elijah could gather, she had lived in Maplewood for longer than anyone could remember. Her husband had been a wealthy businessman, one of the town's prominent figures. People respected her for that, or perhaps feared her. To Mrs. Thompson, appearances were everything, and she did not tolerate what she considered unseemly behavior. It wasn't just that she was wealthy. It was the way she carried herself, with a sense of entitlement that was palpable. And Elijah knew it in his bones, that to her, he was nothing more than a problem, a walking stereotype. Her gaze followed him like a hawk tracking its prey, and it always made him uncomfortable. He could feel the judgment in her eyes, even from across the street. She never once greeted him, never smiled in passing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was always being watched, always being measured by an invisible yardstick. He tried to ignore her, as he usually did, and quickened his pace. The last thing he wanted was to make eye contact, to engage in one of those awkward interactions that left him feeling small, invisible in the wrong ways. He had seen Mrs. Thompson treat other young black men in the neighborhood the same way. She never gave them a chance, never even tried to see beyond the surface. To her, Elijah was no different. But then, as he neared the corner of Oak Street, something happened. Mrs. Thompson stepped off the curb, her eyes never leaving him, Elijah's stomach tightened as he tried to keep walking, hoping she wouldn't do what he feared she might. But she did. She dropped her purse, a heavy, leather bag that clattered to the ground with a sharp, metallic sound. The strap hung loosely in the air for a moment before it hit the pavement. Instinctively, Elijah stopped in his tracks. He had no choice. He couldn't just leave her there, even if he wanted to, despite everything, despite the judgment and the tension that always hung between them. He bent down and reached for the purse. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice steady but low. He could already feel the stares of the few people walking down the street, could feel their eyes boring into him. She didn't respond at first, but then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lifted her eyes from the ground to meet his. For a brief moment, there was silence, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the distant hum of traffic. "Thank you," she muttered, her voice thin and cold. There was no warmth, no gratitude in her tone. She took the purse from his hands without a word and stepped back, her eyes darting over him as though she had seen enough. Elijah's footsteps echoed against the pavement as he made his way down the familiar street, his mind not entirely on the path ahead. He was lost in thought, sketching designs in his head, digital murals of wild landscapes, abstract shapes, and vivid splashes of color. Art was his escape, his passion, a dream he held tightly to amidst the daily struggles. But today, his mind felt heavier than usual. He knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the weather or schoolwork weighing him down. It was the unshakable feeling that the town was slowly closing in on him, trapping him in a box that was impossible to break free from. As he walked past Mrs. Green's house, the sharp, distinct scent of freshly cut grass wafted through the air. Her house was one of the grandest in Maplewood, an old Victorian with a sweeping front porch and tall windows that gleamed like eyes watching every movement. It had always been a symbol of wealth and old money pride. Mrs. Lorraine Green, its occupant, was a fixture in the town, rich, powerful, and well-regarded by those who valued status above all else. She was also known for her caustic tongue, a woman who had a habit of making quick judgments and holding tight to outdated views. Elijah had crossed paths with Mrs. Green more times than he cared to count, and each time, it was always the same, the cold, critical look in her eyes as she peered over her glasses, always sizing him up, always measuring him against the backdrop of her own narrow, prejudiced world. It wasn't even that Elijah had done anything wrong. He had never spoken to her except for a polite good morning on the rare occasion that their paths crossed. But to Mrs. Green, that was enough to make him suspicious. She had long made up her mind about people like him, young, black, male, and no matter how much he proved himself, he would always be seen as a potential threat in her eyes. Today, however, something felt different. As Elijah approached the street corner, he saw Mrs. Green standing at the edge of her meticulously kept lawn, her eyes already fixed on him. She was bent slightly, as if examining something on the ground, but he knew better than to assume she wasn't aware of his every move. Elijah slowed his pace, his heart beating a little faster, not because he feared her, but because he hated the feeling of being watched, scrutinized, simply for existing. It was a weight that never quite lifted. Just as he neared the end of her property, he felt a sudden shift. Mrs. Green, who had been standing still moments ago, moved quickly, almost as if she had been waiting for him to be within reach. Elijah had no time to react. In one swift motion, she dropped her purse in front of him, its contents spilling across the sidewalk with a loud clatter. It was a move so deliberate, so staged, that Elijah felt his stomach twist. The purse had been placed in his path, blocking him from continuing forward, and as it tumbled to the ground, the scattered items seemed to mirror the tension that now lay between them. Elijah paused for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. His mother had always taught him to be kind, to offer help when needed. But in this moment, there was a part of him that wanted to walk away, to ignore the game Mrs. Green was playing. But he couldn't. He couldn't let this woman, or anyone for that matter, think that he would ever stoop to the level of ignoring someone in need. His values were stronger than that. So, he bent down, slowly and carefully, to pick up the wallet, the old receipts, and the fallen lipstick tube that had rolled to the side. He kept his head low, trying not to draw attention to the awkwardness of the situation. The rain started falling more heavily, turning the street into a muted blur of gray. For a second, Elijah thought he could feel Mrs. Green's eyes on him, watching every movement, judging him silently from her perch across the street. He gathered all the items into the purse, standing up to hand them back to her. But as his eyes lifted, he saw the same look he had grown so familiar within her gaze, a look of disdain, of suspicion, of fear. For a moment, Elijah wondered if this was how it always would be in this town. No matter how polite he was, no matter how successful he could become, the very essence of who he was would always be questioned. He would never be seen for his heart, for his dreams, for his character. He would only be seen for his skin. "Thank you," Mrs. Green said in a cold, clipped voice, not meeting his eyes as she took the purse back. Her lips barely moved, and she was quick to turn away, retreating back to the safety of her grand home. Elijah stood there for a moment, holding the lingering air of tension around him, before walking on, feeling a strange mix of frustration and resignation. The encounter had left him unsettled, but it wasn't the first time he had felt this way, and he doubted it would be the last. As Elijah walked away from Mrs. Green's house, the weight of her gaze still pressed against his back. The rest of the world around him seemed to blur into the rain. His thoughts were a whirlwind, tangled in a web of confusion and doubt. But beneath all the confusion, one thing remained clear. He would never stop pursuing his dreams. No matter how many times people like Mrs. Green tried to knock him down, he would keep moving forward. There was something more waiting for him beyond the boundaries of Maplewood, beyond the small town where he had been trapped for so long. And as he walked through the rain, each step heavier than the last, Elijah couldn't help but wonder just how much longer it would take for him to break free. Elijah's chest tightened. The brief moment of kindness was over. Just like that, he knew better than to expect anything more. He nodded stiffly and took a step back, forcing a smile that felt heavy on his face. But before he could turn away, Mrs. Thompson's voice stopped him. "Don't think you can fool everyone, Elijah," she said, her words clipped. "People like you don't belong in places like this." The sting of her words hit him like a slap. He didn't look back, though. He couldn't. Instead, he kept walking, his head held high, his heart pounding in his chest. As he rounded the corner, the weight of her words hung in the air like a cloud, following him every step of the way. Maplewood, with all its beauty and charm, was not kind to people like Elijah, and he knew, deep down, that it would take much more than a moment of kindness to change that. Elijah's gaze flickered nervously to the side as he saw Mrs. Green step down from her porch, the clack of her heels against the stone steps startling in the otherwise quiet street. She moved with the precise grace of someone who had spent her entire life holding power over her surroundings. And today, it seemed, was no different. As Elijah reached the corner of Willow Avenue, the edge of his peripheral vision caught her movement again. She was standing by the sidewalk now, watching him approach, and before he could adjust his pace or change his direction, she did something unexpected. With a swift motion, she dropped her purse right in front of him, its contents scattering across the sidewalk. The force of the drop made Elijah flinch, his stomach tight with uncertainty. He stopped instinctively, and his first impulse was to bend down and help, not because he was afraid of what might happen, but because it was the right thing to do. The world had already painted him with enough suspicion. He would not add to that narrative by walking away from someone in need. He knelt down and began picking up the items, an old wallet, a few loose coins, and a small leather notebook. As he gathered them, Elijah's mind raced. He had grown up in this town. He had been to every school, played in every park, and sat in the very pews of the local church. But despite all of that, the harsh truth remained. The town had a way of seeing him that he couldn't escape. To most, he was simply a black teenager, a threat in their eyes, regardless of who he was or what he stood for. And it was moments like this, unspoken, uncomfortable, and full of implied judgment, that reminded him just how fragile his place in this town really was. "Thank you." Mrs. Green's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and edged with something almost imperceptible. Was it fear? It made him look up, and their eyes met for the briefest of moments. But that's when it happened. She flinched. It was small, a barely perceptible shift in her posture. But to Elijah, it felt like a shockwave. He could almost feel the judgment in her eyes. And for a split second, he saw the thin veil of civility drop away. He wasn't just Elijah anymore. He was someone else in her eyes. Someone that made her uncomfortable. Someone that didn't belong. That flicker of fear in her gaze told him everything. Without saying a word, Mrs. Green took a small step back, clutching her purse to her chest. Her lips tightened, and for a fleeting second, Elijah saw the distant past reflected in her expression, the ghosts of the old prejudices that still held sway over Briarfield. Prejudices that could never be erased. No matter how much progress the world made, Elijah stood there for a moment, holding her belongings in his hands, unsure of how to respond. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, a burden far heavier than any physical object. He could say something, confront her for her behavior, stand up for himself, or walk away in silence. But what would it change? Mrs. Green wouldn't see him any differently. She would still look at him as though he were a stranger, a threat in disguise. He handed her the items, but his hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "You're welcome," he said, his voice low but steady. It wasn't a thank you. Not really. It was a declaration, a statement of his dignity. He wouldn't apologize for his existence. He wouldn't let her or anyone else make him feel small. With one last glance at her, he turned and began walking away. His heart was pounding in his chest, but not from fear, no. It was something different this time. It was the feeling of knowing that while he couldn't change Mrs. Green's mind, he could still walk with his head held high. As Elijah moved further down the street, his thoughts turned inward. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet sense of resolve. He wasn't just Elijah Carter, the kid from Briarfield. He was someone more than the world tried to define him as. He had dreams, big ones, and they were not bound by the narrow limits of this small town. The sky above was beginning to shift, the last traces of sunlight slipping behind the clouds. But Elijah didn't mind. He had his own light now, one that no one could dim, no matter how hard they tried. And so, he walked on, toward his future, and toward a world where his value would never be determined by the color of his skin.